Life of David Livingston, Part 48. The gold mines of Samaila, which are some 40 or 50 miles northward of those of Nakatu, though nearly as rich as the latter, are in hills of rock and sandstone, which substances are pounded in mortars that the gold may be extracted. Barth judged that gold would be found in the Benue River and the principal eastern tributary of the Niger. Gold, silver, iron, lead, and sulfur have been found in large quantities and were long profitably mined in the mountainous districts of Angola. In the upper Guiana, gold and iron are deposited in granitic or schistose rocks. The interior contains vast quantities of iron which might be easily mined, but the natives are not sufficiently enterprising to accomplish much in this respect. Gold is also obtained in the beds of some of the rivers of Guiana. In Mozambique, on the east coast, the Portuguese have for a great length of time had a considerable commerce in gold obtained from mines near the Zambezi, in the region near the western limit of that province. It has already been stated that here Dr. Livingston discovered deposits of coal along the Orange and Vaal rivers. In extreme South Africa have recently been discovered diamond fields, which some have noted scientists believe will yet prove to be among the richest in the world. Perhaps the portions of Africa which are the most interesting on account of geological investigations which have been made are the valley of the Nile in Egypt and the deserts of the Sahara. It is well known that the river Nile annually overflows its banks in Egypt, and the inundation remaining a considerable period, a thin layer of soil is each year added to that which existed there before. This Nile mud, as it is called by geologists, has been the subject of considerable scientific examination for many years. In his work upon the geological evidences of the antiquity of man, Sir Charles Lyell gives a full account of certain seismic borings in the Nile mud, which were made between the years 1851 and 1854 under the superintendency of Mr. Leonard Horner, but who employed to practically conduct the examinations and intelligent, enterprising, faithful Armenian officer of engineers, Hekekyan Bey, who had for many years pursued scientific studies in England, was in every way qualified for the task, and, unlike Europeans, was able to endure the climate during the hot months. When the waters of the Nile flow within their banks, Sir Charles Lyell states that the results of chief importance arising of this inquiry were obtained from two sets of shafts and borings, sunk at intervals in lines crossing the great valley from east to west. One of these consists of 51 pits and artesian perforations made where the valley of 16 miles wide between the Arabian and Libyan deserts, in the latitude of Heliopolis, about 8 miles above the apex of the delta. The other line of pits and borings, 27 in number, was in the parallel of Memphis, where the valley is 5 miles wide. Besides Hekekyan Bey, several engineers and some 60 workmen inured to the climate were employed for several years during the dry season in the furtherance of these interesting investigations. It was found that in all the works of the sediment passed through was similar in composition to the ordinary Nile mud of the present day, except near the margin of the valley, where thin layers of quartose sand such as this is sometimes blown from the adjacent desert by violent winds, were observed to alternate with the loam. A remarkable absence of lamination and stratification, the geologist goes on to say, was observed almost universally in the sediment brought up from all points except where the sandy layers above alluded to occurred. The mud, closely agreeing in character with the ancient loam of the Rhine, Mr. Horner attributes this want of all indication of successive deposition to the extreme thinness of the film of matter which is thrown down annually on the great alluvial plain during the season of inundation. The, the tenuity of this layer must indeed be extreme. In the French engineers, if the French engineers are tolerably correct in their estimate of the amount of sediment formed in a century, which they suppose not to exceed on the average of 5 inches, it is stated, in other words, that the increase is not more than the 20th part of an inch a year, or a foot in a period of 240 years. All that remains of organic bodies found in these investigations under Hecek Bay belong to living species. Bones of the ox, the hog, the dog, the dromedary, the ass were not uncommon, but no vestiges of extinct mammalia were found. No marine shells were anywhere detected. These excavations were on a large scale, in some instances for the first 16 or 24 feet. In these pits, vast jars, vases, and small human figure in burnt clay, a copper knife, and other entire articles were dug up. But when water soaking through from the Nile was reached, the boring instrument used was too small to allow of more than fragments of works of art were being brought up. Pieces of burnt brick and pottery were consistently being extracted, and from all depths, even where they sank 60 feet below the surface towards the central parts of the valley. In none of these cases did they get to go to the bottom of the alluvial soil. If it be assumed that the sediment of the valley has increased at the rate of 6 inches a century, bricks at that depth of 60 feet have been buried for 12,000 years. If the increase has been 5 inches a century, they have lain there dormant during a period of 14,400 years. Lyle states further on that M. Rosary, in the great French work on Egypt, has estimated the rate of deposit of sediment in the delta at 2 inches and 3 lines in a century. A fragment of red brick has been excavated a short distance from the apex of the delta at the depth of 22 feet, at a rate of deposit of 2.5 inches a century. A work of art 72 feet deep must have been buried more than 30 years ago. Lyle frankly states, however, that if the boring was made where the arm of the river had been silted up at a time when the apex of the delta was somewhat further south or more distant from the sea than now, the brick in question might be comparatively very modern. It is agreed that by the best geologists of that age of the Nile that mud that cannot be accurately but only approximately calculated by the delta thus far furnished. The amount of matter thrown down by the waters in different parts of the plain varies so much that to strike an average with any approach to accuracy must be most difficult. The nearest approach, perhaps, as has been observed by Baldwin, to obtaining an accurate chronometric scale for ascertaining the age of the deposits of the Nile is at a given point was made near Memphis at the statue of King Ramses. It's known that this statue was erected about the year 1260 BC. In 1854, it had stood for about 3,114 years. During that time, the aluminum had collected to the depth of 9 feet and 4 inches above its base, which was at the rate of about 3.5 inches every century. Mr. Horner found the aluminum below the base of the statue to be 30 feet deep. The pottery and pottery was found within 4 inches of the bottom of the aluminum. I'm not sure that it says aluminum. It's Alluvium. Alluvium. If the rate of accumulation previous to the building of the statue had been the same as subsequently, the formation of the alluvium began at that point about 11,660 years before the Christian era, and men lived there some 12,360 years ago, cultivating the then thin soil of the valley. But it would appear to be certain that the average deposit is so slight annually that many centuries more than those formerly quite universally received as the age of the world for the stage of mankind's achievements must have passed since the work of man's hands have been buried under the vast deposits of alluvium. Thus, geology insists is the fact of man's existence long before the historic era conclusively established. The desert of the Sahara presents in some interesting facts of the same nature. It has already been stated that this part of Africa was ocean within a comparably recent geological period. Tristram and several French officers of scientific attainments who have made geological examinations of large portions of the desert have shown that the northern margin is lined with ancient sea beaches, and lines of terraces, the rock-bound coasts of the old ocean. Numerous salt lakes exist in the deserts, which are tenanted by common cockle, a species of Heligenes which inhabits the Gulf of Guinea, is found in the Salt Lake in latitude 30 degrees north, longitude 7 degrees east, separated therefore from its present marine habitat by the whole extent of the Great Desert and the vast expanse of Sudan and Guyana. Geologists hence conclude that the existing fauna, including man, occupied Africa long before the Sahara became dry land. Reference has been made in the preceding chapter to the supposed remarkably beneficent effect this great expanse of desert, heated sands, and hot air has upon the climate, and consequently upon the civilizations of Europe. It is probable that from the fact that the Sahara was about the last extensive portion of land to be abandoned by the ocean, and the general opinion became prevalent that the continent of Africa was geologically the most recent of the grand divisions of the earth, though supposed to be the oldest in civilization, it has been supposed to be the youngest in geological constitution. I'm informed by scientific men that on account of recent investigation and reasonings, the opinion has for some time been gaining ground that Africa is likely to be shown to be the oldest part of the globe in both respects, to have been the original birthplace of the race of man.